Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. The year is 2021. We are in crisis. A man named Jake Angeli is president, the QAnon shaman. He stormed the Capitol as part of an elite group of QAnon, Trump, brown-shirted, red-hatted hordes, reminiscent of everything from the Cat Putsch, the March on Rome, the Siege of Madrid, the Siege of Zaragoza, the brief Siege of Mallorca, the BNP winning a council seat in Burnley in 1999, all of which combined together in one horrific fascist coup which defies the imagination and defies reality itself. Washington is a smoking ruin. AOC and the squad have been taken away to be forcibly shown Dinesh D'Souza movies using the Ludovico technique from A Clockwork Orange. This horror has all unfolded. And that is what I would be saying to you if this was a podcast brought to you by Verso Books or Jacobin. Fortunately, for integrity terms, none of that is true. But maybe for our bank account terms, we should have gone down that road. Apparently, it's where the money is. But no, what we're doing this week is we're finally asking the Trump question, the big one, which is, was the orange bad man ever the American Mussolini? Was he the Yankee Hitler? Was he the Deep South Salazar? Was he the Deep Fried Franco? Any of those things that could have come out of Matt Christman's fertile imagination. Now, what we intend to do here is to look at Trump as he actually was and is, in terms of what he stood for, how he governed, the class forces that both brought him to power, sustained him there for a little while, and ultimately then the rearrangement of those class forces which saw him exit power rather melodramatically and anticlimactically at the same time. And we're going to be using a variety of analytical tools to go through this, including historical comparisons to actual fascist movements, because the basis of our analysis is going to be that the talk of Trump as a fascist is a bunch of hyperventilating bourgeois crap. Now, that's me shorthanding it, but Layla, do you want to talk a little bit about what we'll be doing here and what we'll be using to illuminate the question?
We are going to be starting out by looking at these two Paxton articles, one that came out at the beginning of Trump's tenure and one that he recently wrote as Trump was exiting, to kind of get an understanding of like what the bourgeoisie was really thinking with respect to Trump. I think some of them jumped immediately on the fascist bandwagon, but Paxton is probably one of the more reasonable bourgeois intellectuals that exist. So he took a few years before getting there. So I think that his evolution kind of mirrors the left's evolution on this question as well. And so he's a good kind of way of understanding what exactly the argument was that in terms of Trump being a fascist and what that actually meant to the bourgeoisie to say that someone is a fascist. My knowledge of history is it's improving, but I definitely think it's lacking in detail more. I know the big parts of it. So I'd be interested in hearing you get into the nitty-gritties of what exactly fascism was historically, and to let us know if something that feels like fascism today is that really fascism though? It feels like it, but is it the real thing?
Yeah. All you need is a baseball cap and bang, instant fascism. So do you want to say who Paxton is, like what his position is?
Yeah, so Paxton is I'll admit that when Trump was elected, I was a young grad student, and he's a well-known historian of fascism, actually. He's written several books on the topic. He's got his PhD from Harvard. He's a Columbia emeritus professor, or professor emeritus, however you say it. He's a venerable old man and 88 years old at this point. And so I remember when Trump was elected, I was like very alarmed, actually. And I remember texting my friends and stuff, and we were all kind of freaking out about it. And I remember reading his article actually in 2017 and feeling very relieved and very reassured that this was actually not fascism. So he wrote this article in 2017 saying that Trump was not a fascist, even though everyone might think he's a fascist because He was seeking no territorial gains. He was, kind of focusing on excluding immigrants in a symbolic way, which is not really the same thing. And the fact that he had unchecked executive power was more indicative of a generic, dictatorship, which at this point, even now, I would say is a bit exaggerated, but rather than fascism in particular. However, at this point, Paxton has come out and said that although he had hesitated in granting Trump the fascist label, in 2021, he is ready to make the call. Trump is a fascist. And the reason he gave is because basically the coup was, I think, the real breaking point in a lot of bourgeois minds. That was what really pushed them over the edge. So he just says basically that the coup was a wanton attack on American democracy. It was his open encouragement of civic violence to overturn an election was crossed a red line, that red line into fascism. And although it was a failed takeover, and Biden has now been elected, and he can, and the quote, the new American president can begin his work of healing on January 20th. So we are a few weeks into that work of healing. It's still been a very tough challenge for American democracy. So that's basically it. He kind of embeds his argument by, instead of making a comparison to the two major fascist movements that most people know about, and certainly what I know about, which is the Italian movement under Mussolini, and of course the Nazi German movement under Hitler, he makes a comparison to 1934 France, where there was fascist demonstrations at the eve of the election of Léon Blum, who was a Jewish socialist who was elected, and they also failed to take the parliamentary building there. So, what do you think? Do you think that that's an accurate comparison, like the mega chuds taking over the capital to the fascists in France trying to cross into the Place de la Concorde to take over? Or do you think that's a bit too, I don't know. Are you ready to kind of push back against Paxton's interpretation?
I think that I'm reading both of these. It struck me that this is a real example of how completely stunted even the more intelligent bourgeois intellectuals have become. And shall we start with just a look at the direct comparison between the Capitol Hill riot and this event that took place back in 1934?
Yeah, I would love to hear more about. So 1934. So who are the main antagonists? Who are the belligerents in that situation?
Well, you've got 1934. The historical context there is that you have two things that you just do not have in the modern day United States or in Britain or in Canada, which is that you have in France and all of Europe, you have a mass militant working class movement, very strong trade unions in France, and a very strong and still relatively young Communist Party, all of which is it's the militancy of the working class in the period coming out of the Great Depression in France and after World War One as well. So you've had 15, 16 years of very, very harsh and often brutal class struggle in France. You have a Communist Party which is a very strong working class organization, powering and also being powered by a lot of this struggle. You have Blum, who is not a communist. He's a member of the Parti Socialiste, the traditional Second International Party in France. He's at the head of this Popular Front coalition that includes a whole range of people from the socialists through to sort of liberal reformists. And he comes to power for the first time on the back of a wave of strikes. And then there was a general strike when he won the election, which then he responded to by negotiating a series of concessions with the French trade union leaders, which he thought would secure industrial peace. But due to the nature of the crisis of capitalism, that industrial peace simply did not happen. I give that as the foreground because looking at American politics now, how many of those factors are present?
Well, Paxton actually does address that. I'm not sure which article he does it in, or maybe I read it somewhere else. But essentially he says, in the 2021 one, where he does call Trump a fascist. So he says that like Hitler and Mussolini, Trump knew how to pose as the only effective bulwark against an advancing left. All the more fearful because it took on cultural forms unfamiliar to provincial rural America, things like feminism, black power, gay rights. So do you think that replaces the type of working class left that existed in France?
No, that's gibberish. His framing there is so completely wrong, and it's completely wrong because of Paxton himself and his class position, which is as an intellectual of the bourgeoisie. See, the French bourgeoisie in 1934 is swinging more and more over to being pro-fascist. They're seeing the fascists as a solution, much like they were in Germany and Italy for the ruling class, to their problem with the militant working class. And to say that, first of all, a lot of the examples he gives in this supposedly this culture war that Trump is supposedly like the avatar of the reaction against, a lot of those examples are 50 odd years old. It's like we'll get into this more as we go along, but like no one's refighting the civil rights era.
Yep.
There's even the most sort of ardently right-wing Republicans aren't doing that. In fact, the more and more see figures coming through into the Republican Party who are very typical of American conservatism, who aren't white. So no one's talking about this idea that Trump was an avatar of a return to the Jim Crow era is just simply untrue on every conceivable level. Most of all, the material level that the Jim Crow era existed on has gone. You know, the reason why it came into existence in the first place is because of the demands of the Southern agriculturalists to keep the black population on the land and very low paid and repressed, to keep agriculture cheap. That was what it was all about. That's all gone now. Agriculture is very cheap because because agribusiness owns everything now. They don't need that anymore. And the idea that, the last president who won an election with a partly by running a gay scare was George W. Bush, who people like, I don't know if Paxton did himself, but the people the U.S. bourgeoisie is now holding up as a paragon of resistance to the evils of Trump. And Trump barely said a single word about either women's rights or gay rights. He just didn't. His appointments to his inner circle were often filled with women who actually some of whom had come up through his TV shows. He never talked about reversing course on women's rights. He never really talked about gay rights at all. There was a controversy over the trans ban in the military, but I don't know why anybody who would consider themselves to be even a vaguely socialistic person would be bothered about who the hell can serve in the U.S. Imperial Death Army. But most of all, I want to. It's the old joke, isn't it, about once a trans person is the one pushing the button on the drone missile, then we've reached equality. But the circle back around to this idea that the ruling class, because of the class dynamic in early 1930s France, were seeing fascism as their solution to the militant working class, to the class conflicts, because clearly they didn't. Because what happened in Italy and Germany was that the ruling class had lost confidence in the traditional institutions of the state to enforce capitalist order. which is why they needed to turn to the fascists as this sort of semi-external force to come in and re-legitimize the state and to enable the repression to be done that much more effectively. That is not present here.
Okay, so Alex, what you're saying to me is that fascism is a response to working class, to increasing or expressed working class power. So it's a class conflict between, it is an expression of class conflict between, an expression of worsening class conflict between the capitalist class and the working class. Is that your idea of what fascism is?
It's exactly what fascism is, because we can demonstrate it. Should we go into the historical examples a little more?
Definitely. Yeah, let's go into the historical examples a bit more, because I think I want to address this idea that there is a class conflict, though, eventually. So maybe we can do it a little later. But like the idea that like the stormers of the Capitol were this class, and they're in conflict with this other class. But anyways, like let's go. I think going into the historical examples to illustrate that will be helpful.
Well, there is a class conflict going on, but it's not in the way that Paxton thinks it is. I mean, like much of what the commentary around a lot of political events in the last 5 to 10 years, it's the opposite or a very distorted version of what they're portraying.
Yeah.
So why don't we? So I'll start just a brief bit about Mussolini and how he came to be in power. So between about 1918, in the end of World War One, and 1922, you get 4 years of continual class struggle in Italy, a very violent class struggle that was partially inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution itself, inspired a huge upsurge in struggle in the factories in the north of Italy, in Turin and Milan and places like that, and the big car factories like the big Fiat factories, is the huge car maker that still exists in Italy to this day. You get that, and then you also get the struggle on the land in the south of Italy, which is still to this day the more agrarian and poverty-stricken of the two halves of Italy. So in the 1900s, you have the south of Italy dominated by these feudal, semi-feudal, absentee landlords who still try and run their old estates like it was the feudal period, where you get hyper-exploited peasant labor on those estates. And suddenly, when the Bolsheviks come to power, and they, with the slogan of the land to the peasants, or the free word slogan, peace, bread, land, suddenly the peasants take great inspiration from this and start doing land occupations of these landed estates. And because of the level of conflict got to the point where there was huge factory occupations for like weeks at a time, workers completely boycotting production or starting to try and run the factories themselves, you got to the point where the Italian political system, which since the unification of Italy had been rather unstable, the Italian state was not able to form a strong enough government to carry out the repression that the ruling class was screaming for. So like you get a succession of prime ministers between 1918 to 22 in brief governments, none of whom can deal adequately from the bourgeoisie's perspective with the occupations of the factories and the battles that were taking place on the land. Paxton himself observes in one of his articles that there was a civil war situation going on in Italy. It was a nationwide class struggle, from which births the Italian Communist Party, because the Italian socialists basically balk at taking power. They have multiple opportunities between 1918 to 22, the PSI, Partito Socialista Italiano, to take power, and they fail to. They back off every single time and just say, oh, we want another election. So you have these multiple opportunities for the party of the working class to take power. They fail to take it every single time. The Italian communists are far too small to carry it out, but the ruling class, both the aristocracy, the landed aristocracy and the industrialists, is desperate for this movement of the workers to end. And so they bring in Mussolini, or they employ Mussolini and his the fascist squadristi, the fascist squads, were mostly demobilized soldiers. Often, I mean, Mussolini himself was he was more of a syndicalist than a Marxist. He was the editor of Avanti, the daily newspaper for the old Italian Socialist Party. But he comes in with this new. He doesn't describe himself as a fascist at first. He still starts. He was still describing himself in terms of being some sort of national syndicalist. But then he adopts the fascist mantle, and he is employed as a strike breaker, essentially. To go around beating up and using paramilitary methods to break strikes, using paramilitary methods to brutalize peasants and force them out of the land occupations. And that's where he comes from. So he's this guy whose entire political background was in working class politics and trade unionism. He's now being employed as essentially a nationwide gang of strike breakers, which is hardly the first time that's happened and won't be the last time either. So that's who Mussolini is. It's who he's employed as a strikebreaker when the bourgeoisie in Italy feel like they can't rely on the Italian army and the state forces to carry out the repression anymore. Now he then gets into a point where the Italian working class movement and the peasants and the fascists are in this state of near warfare. It's still very chaotic up to 1923 when he stages what he called the March on Rome, which is this very melodramatic thing where Mussolini was going to march on Rome and demand power. In reality, a deal had already been done with the Italian ruling class that the king was
I didn't know that.
Yeah, the king was going to appoint.
It was a coup.
No, it wasn't. Mussolini and the fascists had they came to power constitutionally via an invite from the Italian king. And they were, just like Hitler was 10 years later, they were initially in coalition with the old conservative parties of the industrialists and the aristocracy. The purpose of bringing Mussolini in was because he had by then a mass movement behind him, though it was never as powerful as Hitler's was a decade later. Bringing him in would then enable them to sort of bring in this fascist militias into the state. They could portray then the entrance of Mussolini into government. Both Mussolini and the Italian bourgeoisie would then be able to portray his entry into government as a sort of a dramatic new start. A lot of Mussolini's language at the time is based on the specific Italian political problems that had never been solved from the unification period. So Mussolini was saying a lot about, well, this is the next stage in the Risorgimento. I'm now reuniting the country. I'm solving the problems that the early period of unification didn't solve. We're going to get Italian glory back. We're going to conquer these places in Africa, all that kind of shit. And so this was the great relegitimation of the Italian state by bringing the fascists in. So his appointment was, under the Italian constitutional arrangements at the time, entirely legal and constitutional. And so I'll pause there because I know I've spoken quite a bit, but does that illuminate any further?
Yeah, and I think one thing I want to kind of zone in on, which is a key difference between the Marxist interpretation of what fascism is and the bourgeois interpretation, is an understanding of like who supports the fascists, how they come into power, and who is the base that makes up fascists. Reading through a lot of the accounts from bourgeois historians, they make it seem as though fascism is a mass movement that is supported by large segments of the working class even. But when you look into the Mussolini's example, for instance, or Hitler's example, for instance, fascist parties have historically gone in very little of the working class kind of vote and support, especially when the working class is organized. In Germany, for instance, like it was extremely difficult for fascist movements to get a foothold in organized factories and organized segments of the working class. And they derived a lot of their support from the petty bourgeoisie, so shopkeepers and things like what the petty bourgeoisie was at the time, which is like shopkeepers and artisans and stuff like that, and also the peasantry of what remained of it. So I think it's important to kind of underline how fascism is not and was never an expression of working class politics. It's not like the working class is not reactionary in that way. It's not going. When Hitler, like when the vote share that the Nazi Party got was something around 32% or something like that.
Yeah.
And the only reason he was able to gain power is because the kind of socialist working class vote was split between the two main left parties at the time. So you can remind me what those are: SPD and
KPD.
Yeah, that's
Communist
right, yes.
Partei Deutschland, German Communist Party.
Yeah, and so he was able to ascend because the Social Democrats refused to make a 11th hour pact with the communists to stop the ascension of Hitler. And so because they were afraid of triggering a civil war, what they're really afraid of is a Stalinist takeover, like an actual communist revolution. So they took the side of the bourgeoisie, and we know what happened in the end.
Did not work out well.
It was a bad bet for the leaders of that party, that's for sure. So I think that it is kind of important to highlight that, because when there isn't a working class struggle going on, when there isn't, like in our time, when there isn't a significant working class political expression, I mean, there isn't any in the United States. Both parties are to their core bourgeois.
Yeah.
There isn't a need for fascism. Like
yes.
there is nothing to respond to. So we are viewing something is happening. I think that there are some similarities between what happened then and what's happening now. So for instance, fascists, the first thing they did was to slash wages and break the labor movement that did exist. Like Italy saw wage cuts of 50%. Child labor was reintroduced in Italy when the fascists came into power. There was a lot more corporate welfareism, which I think there's a ton of nowadays. So there are some similarities, but I think that the main reason why we cannot understand the current expression of capitalist authoritarianism as fascist is because there is nothing to respond to. So the antagonist is defeated. The working class is currently defeated.
Yeah, and the key thing is that both in Mussolini's case and in Hitler's case, they invited in people who were relative outsiders as a gamble, the bourgeoisie do. So, for instance, Hitler and Mussolini are both last throws of the dice by capital, because fascism itself is a risky move for the ruling class.
Yeah.
And that needs to be emphasized much more often. They turn, using the Nazis as an example. Now, the Nazis were a sort of eccentric, far-out nationalist grouping who were so bananas, were regarded as completely mad by even other like German conservatives in the 1920s. Now, what happens is two things. First of all, you get the Wall Street crash, Great Depression period. And what happens is, you mentioned the electoral figures there. What happens is the Social Democrat vote and the Communist vote, the Social Democrats vote broadly holds up, and the Communist vote slowly starts to grow quite a bit in each election after the middle 1920s, to the point where you're getting the Communists are making serious gains largely from the Social Democrats. Because what you've got there is two parties splitting the working class voting base between them. Mm-hmm. What happens is that all the centre and all the other conservative and right wing parties and a lot of liberal parties all disappear from the electoral map or are wiped out between 29 and 33, and all those votes start to flow to the right, and because all the people who were in the petty bourgeoisie in Germany, so the small capitalists, small businessmen, store owners, shopkeepers, small to medium-sized landowners, and millions of people who all previously, in electoral terms, split their votes between, like, there was a number of sort of centre parties. There was a sizable Catholic party. There was various other shades of German conservatism. All of that empties itself into the NSDAP by 1933, and that's where the vote's coming from. Which is another word
for the Nazi Party.
The full name is National Socialist German Workers' Party, National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiterpartei.
Good job.
Yeah, German's my other language.
Really?
Well, kind of. It's I learnt it in a fit of enthusiasm at school, and it's kind of stuck. So the emphasis I'm putting on it there is that when you see the capitalist crisis, you see the reaction from the working class. And the other thing in Germany, of course, is that the Nazis have an armed wing in the form of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, stormtroopers, and then later to be replaced by the Schutzstaffel, the SS. So I also have then the militias of the Social Democrats and the Communists and other working class aligned organizations. So all of these groups are having a shooting war in the street between the late 20s and the early 30s. The Communists have a very well organized Red Front militia group. There's a lot of work at rank and file level between the Social Democrat aligned workers and the Communist aligned workers. It's at the leadership level that there's a real problem. So looking at America now, even with, all the hyperventilating liberals do about gun ownership, you cannot say that the ruling class is in a situation where they're facing an armed rebellion. What happened at the Capitol building is not an armed rebellion. There was some guys hanging around with a gun. Isn't an armed rebellion in the same way that Germany was at in 1933. It just is different situation entirely. So the point I want to make is the need for fascism does not exist, and also the need for fascism not existing goes alongside the fact that Trump himself has never been the chosen guy for the majority of the American bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I think it's what Trump was a completely different set of class dynamics than what we have seen traditionally with fascist leaders. And I think that this, like what Paxton is doing, for example, but a lot of other bourgeois intellectuals are doing, is trying to they have like these aesthetic categories that exist. They see the hat, they see the sloganeering, they see Trump's, ability with the media. New York Times said Trump's his use of the term fake news is echoed by the Nazi smear Lügenpresse. So maybe you can pronounce that in German if you want, quote unquote lying press.
Yeah.
So they see these kind of aesthetic expression, like these surface level expressions of coming out of Trumpism, and they're like, oh, this seems really familiar. This is, it really feels like this is like a fascist, and so they're trying to fit in the category, like to kind of force these categories into modern times. So like the left is taken up by Biden and the unions and all of these kind of bourgeois institutions that currently exist, and the right is taken up by Trump and his supporters and stuff like that. But the substance is completely different. Like the state of working class struggle today is, worlds apart from what we saw in Italy or Germany, right? Yeah. So yes, so it's just not a fair comparison. It's not beyond like kind of surface level comparisons, which I think fine. Yeah, I guess you could say that Hitler and Trump had a similar view of the media, but beyond these kind of idealistic interpretations, there isn't much there in terms of the comparison. But
well, it's worth adding that Trump's hardly the first presidential candidate to call the media liars about him.
Yeah, that too. Exactly. Yeah.
Clinton railed against them at various different points. Nixon was famously said that the media is your enemy over and over again to his inner circle. And strangely enough, well, not strangely enough, but the leftists at the time identified Nixon as a Nazi, which again, hyperbolizing about American presidents isn't exactly a new thing.
Yeah, I just think that the bourgeois intellectuals are not able to think of, they don't have the capability because of the class forces at play to be innovative. Like, they're part of a dead-end class. All they can do is basically do reruns.
Yeah.
And so they're not able to, this has come now at this point, it's stopped their ability to even accurately describe current reality. So the bourgeoisie was never able to make any predictive, they were never able to make some kind of, to predict what's going to happen in the future, unlike Marxists. But at this point, they're not even able to describe reality, like current reality, accurately in any meaningful sense. And it's because they don't have the theoretical tools to do so. All they have are like these, foregone battles that they fought, and they can only kind of return to that and figure out how that conflict is happening again in current times, even though it's not.
No, and the obsession with labeling Trump a fascist, I think, speaks to what you were mentioning now, which is that there is a profound degeneration amongst the American bourgeoisie in which they can't produce anything new, not even on the intellectual terrain. So what they do is they have to do this this sort of decontextualized postmodern rehash of history, which is everything is separated from its roots, from its base,
exactly,
and just elevated into the realm of pure aesthetics. And it's worth emphasizing that we've picked up Paxton's work to look at as a kind of foil for this episode. But you can replace these two articles with any number from Jacobin or The Nation or any other of the tin pot leftist websites that essentially just operate as a shrill echo chamber of the bourgeoisie. So if anything, at least Paxton's a better writer. But I could pick up something from, the knuckleheads that work at Jacobin, from an opinion piece from Bhaskar Sankara. I could pick up something from, Raw magazine or whatever any other of these fuck-witted half-wits actually has produced in the last 4 years, and it would be revisiting many of the same tropes, which is that Trump has rallies and therefore Trump's a fascist. Trump has a uniform, a baseball cap, therefore he's a fascist. Trump has the Proud Boys and Hitler had the SS and the SA. Again, none of these stand up. I mean, the leader of the Proud Boys was just exposed as an FBI informant, for fuck's sake. That should tell you a lot about what you need to know there. And also, just to continue with the theme of the bourgeoisie's intellectuals degenerating, they had to portray Trump as the devil in 2016 because that was the role that they had assigned him, that role, because this is a political problem for them, assigning him the role of this sort of fascistic cartoon was the only way they could think of to make Hillary Clinton seem palatable. And that is one of the political reasons why they did this. I mean, we know that from the WikiLeaks documents that were released from the Democratic National Committee. They encouraged Trump to run in the first place, and then they, through giving him billions of dollars worth of free media coverage, they did build him up because they wanted him to be the guy who ran against Clinton. Because in their minds, well, that's great. We'll portray him as a fascist cartoon, and Hillary will be suddenly more palatable. And one of the reasons why they've been so hysterical is because their very clever strategy completely bit them in the arse. So the utility for them of portraying him as a fascist started off with that he would be easily defeated and consigned to oblivion, and it will be 8 glorious years of Hillary. Their sensibilities got pricked by the fact that in 2016 he ran a reasonably innovative campaign for somebody on the American right. He talked about things that a typical Republican wouldn't have done, like Jeb Bush would never have railed against the American bourgeoisie's trade deals, for instance. Mitt Romney would never have gone near that. Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz wouldn't go near that because they're bourgeois politicians to their absolute core. Trump, being a non-politician, famous for being a guy on TV and having the ability through his Twitter account to speak to people unmediated, and the fact, of course, they gave him loads of media anyway in the early days, meant that he was now a figure that was operating somewhat outside of the constraints of the typical bourgeois political setup in the United States. And initially that didn't bother them in the slightest, but when he actually got to the point where he was in power, suddenly, because of his fame and because of the things he was talking about, and because he seemed as he was the outsider, he gains this mass base that is independent of their structures. And that is, I think, the core of why they're so hysterical about him.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit? Okay, so maybe we can talk about what Trump actually did do while he was in power. So reading through his track record, I get the impression that Trump's tenure was actually quite chaotic. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of false starts and dead ends. But what he did do early on is he did nuke the TPP, which is a free trade agreement between 15 nations that he did nuke.
Yeah.
He pulled out of the Paris Agreement. He did achieve that. He did slap some tariffs on China for the reason that he was trying to revive manufacturing jobs in America. That was always a false end because those jobs are gone because of automation, not because they were outsourced principally. Like outsourcing has a bit to do with it, but it's mostly because those jobs have been automated, so they're not coming back. They're gone forever. So anyways, like he did slap some tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum, which China and Beijing imposed some retaliated with some tariffs of their own. He did a lot of protectionist gesturing and, rhetoric. And he did kind of, have a mixed record on, like, I guess, foreign intervention. I think some of the things he did was pretty aggressive interventionist, like pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah.
But overall, he did not start a new war, and he did make a lot of noise towards pulling troops out of existing wars. So I guess the question is, though, like, why was any of this such a big deal for the bourgeoisie? Like, he did overall, like, he did do things like claw back a lot of environmental regulations, and he did attack a labor, whatever labor rights remain in the United States. He did, he went at them pretty hard. And, he did try to, he said he would deregulate banking. He didn't actually deregulate it, but he did reduce the rate of increasing regulations. So, and then of course he cut corporate taxes.
Yes.
So all those things are good for capital.
Yeah.
Obviously. But they still went insane over him anyways. So,
well, I think it's worth unpacking some of those things that he did just a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, the corporate tax cut that he did, the tax cut which benefited mainly the richest, of course, that was on the Paul Ryan's wish list, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives. And that was a standard GOP go-to move that any Republican president would have done. They all embraced that. So
yeah,
that is obviously good for capital, and it's also worth mentioning that the sections of the American capitalist class that are aligned with the Republican Party are slightly different to the ones that are aligned with the Democrats now, considering there's been a realignment going on probably for at least 30 years, maybe longer. You can trace it ultimately back to the early 1970s, where the ruling class elements that are gathered around the Republican Party now are more or less associated with like Silicon Valley and Wall Street. They're more associated with primary resource extraction, so like mining, petrochemicals, people who would benefit immediately from like slashing of environmental regulations and slashing of workers' conditions and health and safety regulations, that kind of thing. So he's serving that particular part of the Republican ruling class base by doing some of the things he did there. TPP, I think, the Trans-Pacific Partnership's abolition did piss them off, because that was, I mean, we will be doing a China episode in the future anyway, which we'll bring this into, but in brief, TPP was Obama's way of trying to handle the contradictory relationship between the US ruling class and the Chinese ruling class. And Obama's plan wasn't to put tariffs on, but to sign all these trade deals with the 15 other Pacific Rim nations that would essentially work on building up areas of low-wage, hyper-exploitative labor in other countries, so that the Western corporations wouldn't choose to invest that as much in China. So essentially, you give the Western capitalist companies other places to exploit, rather than going to China, because Obama, being a slightly more clever bourgeois politician, was trying to balance the fact that an awful lot of money is made in China by the American bourgeoisie with the fact that they don't want the Chinese to be able to develop into a strategic rival, which is going to happen anyway, because that's the logic of the system that they're in. Trump doing away with that and adopting for the more blunt force mechanism of sanctions and tariffs, that did annoy significant sections of the American bourgeoisie who have a lot of interests in China. See, Obama was trying to do this in a way that squared that circle. Trump just went straight for the protectionist measures, which actually caused him a lot of trouble with American farmers who were exporting large amounts of agricultural products to China. So those things are that the tariffs and the trade war are not something that I think any other Republican would have done, but a lot of the other stuff very much is, and very much is reflective of the class basis of the Republican Party, specifically which parts of the bourgeoisie are aligned with it. I think the thing that annoyed them, that sent them over the edge about Trump, was principally the fact that, as I wrote an article about this on my Substack page, which I'll link to in the description, but Trump having this mass base that was outside of the typical structures of either of the main parties in the United States, and a base that had a strong petty bourgeois element to it, but it also had a significant working class element to it. And the fact that he was constantly, all through his presidency, going out, talking to them, communicating with them, rallying them, quite literally. Well, that is something that a bourgeois politician certainly in the post-1989 period is just not supposed to do. I mean, Obama's model of mobilize them for an election, then immediately demobilize them again, is the model that they will allow for. Trump being in a constant direct contact via his Twitter feed with this mass base, constantly going out and talking to it, and even the possibility that he could be influenced to do something by that mass base was a threat that the US capitalist class could not allow, because Trump's a very unpredictable character anyway. As you've correctly said, he would say things, then he would never do anything to actually achieve them. He seemed to think that just tweeting it would make it so. But the fact that the US economy rests on this series of ever escalating debt bubbles, large amounts of what we call fictitious capital. The fact that it needs a system which is very stable in terms of and predictable to keep these various bubbles serviced and not from just blowing up the whole, popping and blowing up everything. The American ruling class demands a politician who is completely predictable and will not not subject to mass-based pressure and will not fly off the handle. Which, even though Trump didn't really do that, it was always a risk that he could. And I think that is the key of why they went so mad.
Do you think that it's accurate to say that Trump ever had, yes, he has a mass base of sorts, but I would never say that his base, is it truly a mass base? I think it kind of looks and feels like one, but digging into the voting data and who supported Trump and stuff, he actually never had a lot of working class support. Working class people don't vote generally for anyone.
Yeah.
When you say mass base, who do you refer to? Who is and was Trump's mass base?
I think
in your opinion,
the base of people who turn up for his rallies. Essentially, what he'd done was he'd taken some of the existing Republican Party base, which is, as you say, the people who actually vote in the United States. It's most of the working class just don't vote at all. So those who do it's the rural and urban petty bourgeoisie. So Trump's base was a more animated version of the Republican Party base that had become slightly more radicalized over time and had some elements of the working class came into it. But what you had there was a radicalized middle and lower petty bourgeoisie base. So whereas when I heard various people say in 2016, 17 that, there's not very many people in that base who weren't typical Republican voters beforehand. I would say that might be true. In fact, it largely is true. But the relationship between a Trump figure and that base is different fundamentally than the relationship that would have been there between John McCain and that base or Jeb Bush and that base. They would have seen it in the manner of typical bourgeois politicians as something to be summoned to an election and then dismissed again. Trump saw it as very much his personal following, and it was to a large degree his personal following of a significant chunk of the American middle class who had largely either voted Republican or hadn't voted before and followed him personally for a variety of different reasons, but were rooted in the fact that there was some changes going on within American capitalism which did subject them to certain pressures and forces that Trump in his own strange way was responding to. And the fact that he had that different relationship with them, even though it was a more petty bourgeois base, it certainly wasn't a mass working class base. That is what was the worry to them.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So I would agree. I think I'm 100% on board with your interpretation of modern day capital, that it is so fragile that it cannot tolerate even a little bit of dissent anymore. But I kind of struggle with the idea that I think it's more I don't actually think that Trump was ever a threat to accumulation in any significant way. Even the tariffs that he applied, and even though they were pretty ham-fisted, what happened was pretty much the same thing as what Obama's approach would have achieved, which is that globalization continued, but it just continued in different periphery countries around China, like Vietnam, for instance.
Yeah.
So I think that, yes, I think I take a little bit of a different, maybe not that different, but a little bit of a different view that a lot of what we're seeing right now is kind of bourgeois paranoia. They see something that kind of looks like a working class political expression, like in Trump, the aesthetics perhaps of working class culture as they see it. not as it actually is, but as they view it, and they get really scared. And then they react in a way that's completely disproportional to what the actual situation on the ground is. And I think that really comes out in the so-called coup attempt, where, when looking, reading about the attendees and what they did and stuff like that, it's clear that that was not a working class kind of workers' struggle against American democracy.
American working class couldn't afford to travel to Washington.
Yeah, and if you read about the professions of people who were arrested, they were all petty bourgeois. Some of them were quite wealthy. Like working people have to be at work. They, it's not. There were a few working class people, like for sure, but most of them were not. Like they can't just take a few days off work to just go to a protest and risk their job and risk their livelihood to go participate in a storming of the Capitol. That's not something that working people with families are able to do. Like they're not going to put their livelihood at stake for something like that. So yeah, like I think though, like, all right, so we are seeing some kind of conflict, and I think I'm trying to edge towards this like thesis. Like, what are we actually seeing then? Like, there is something that's going on. There is a conflict. Do you believe in the elite the elite conflict theory, where what we're actually seeing is a class struggle between different factions of the petty bourgeoisie, with big capital on one side and small capital on the other, broadly speaking? Do you think that's a fair interpretation of what's going on and what went on with the coup?
No, I think what we've seen, and I think you hit on it when you were saying that about the extreme paranoia and delusions of the American ruling class, which really have gone completely overboard in recent years. Mm-hmm. I think the extreme vulnerability and the extreme fragility of the system, of the capitalist system, the fact that it, after 2008, it's just had to be endlessly underpinned by huge amounts of essentially off-the-books state spending via the Federal Reserve. Same thing in Britain. The fact that the rate of profit doesn't recover. They haven't found a way to restore even the profitability of the 90s. All of that serves as the base for a lot of instability. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the capitalist class is about to implode. Ruling classes don't just implode. There has to be a counterforce that throws them out. But even the fact that Trump played with certain tropes and ideas and made this nationalistic appeal he got a significant switch of working class votes in some key states in 2016 by talking about the trade deals, by attacking the fact that the Democratic Party didn't. When he stands up and he says that Democrats don't give a shit about you, that does have a certain resonance because it's true. But even just that small move towards questioning the fundamental underpinnings of American capitalism since the 80s, even that sent them into a tailspin. And that is a reflection of the fragility of it. It's a reflection of the fact that the personnel in the state machine have gotten worse over time. They have become more both complacent and ignorant, and also complacent, ignorant, and very, very stupid, which is that the ruling class has become more and more dense over time because they've had it almost their own way for so long, because it's been so long since there was mass class struggle in the United States, because that class struggle, which is the basis of real political action, is not there, instead of which it's filled with this intra-ruling class fight. Now, there is a material end to this, which is there is a battle between the elements of the American capitalist class that have their investments more overseas, and those who are more domestic capital, and those are generally more aligned these days with the Republican Party than the Democrats. And the Democrats are now, and have been for quite some time, the more external facing and aggressively imperialist party in the United States. They're both imperialist parties, but certainly in the Trump era, with Trump taking on an element of protectionism, economic nationalism, and in words at least, attempting to draw down certain imperial adventures. So he talks about withdrawing from Syria. He said that the Libyan war was a bad idea, and he never really did anything about any of this. But the fact that he would go near that scares the bits of the American ruling class who depend an awful lot on not just the investments overseas, but the opening up of new markets via aggressive American military action. And that's something which we need to explore maybe more in future episodes. What does imperialism actually look like these days? But it's a product, and I keep coming back to this, it's a product of the profound weakness, relative weakness of the American capitalist class, that they've basically gone mad over a guy who governed like a fairly typical Republican, who was voted into office with a fairly typical Republican vote.
Yeah. Yeah.
The fact that he played with certain things that seemed out of the ordinary, that they thought had long been relegated, that he made an appeal to the working class as a class, even if that appeal didn't really go very far, that was enough for them to lose it.
Something you said to me, which I thought was a really good insight, is that a lot of us assume that the ruling class acts rationally. But actually, it doesn't seem like that's the case anymore. I think that many members of the ruling class are actually completely irrational. They're very driven by emotion, actually. And I think that really comes out with that underscores the fact that the productive base is so swelled by fictitious capital, which is controlled almost exclusively by the emotions of those that hold the stock. So yeah, once you realize that, then things become a lot clearer. It becomes much more clear. These kind of like histrionic reactions to various events, including this pandemic, becomes a lot more clear when you realize that it's just all irrational. It's big. I view a lot of this as a show the bourgeoisie is putting on for itself to understand its own condition, because it lacks any theory of history and it lacks a theory of capitalism.
Yes.
And so all it can do is an aesthetic play for itself to try to reassure itself and try to understand the world. We don't need that because we do have a theory of capitalism and we have a theory of history, but they do. So I think that goes, I think it's a really, like, people need to realize that, like, everyone, basically the superstructure is just staffed by idiots that are highly emotional. There's no way of putting it. Like, everyone is dumb. The scientists are dumb. The professors are dumb. The same kind of stuff that we've seen with Paxton here, with his kind of, at least a symbolic attempt to stick with historical analysis. And then his like recent just kind of, just abandoning the methods of historiography and just completely going with market imperatives is exactly what we've seen with scientists as well, with the COVID-19 pandemic. The same exact thing. So yeah, I think that it's just complete irrationality, and the only way to rationally understand it is from the perspective of the proletariat at this point, because the bourgeoisie has lost its ability to even describe reality accurately.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it, which is that elucidates quite a lot of modern political events, which is that the ruling class has always had, the capitalist class has always had, a strong element of irrationality to it, because capitalism has always had a strong element of irrationality to it. So even if you go back and look at Marx and Engels writing in like the 1850s and 60s and 70s, they're looking at like the stock market panics over comparatively minor things, and saying, well, they're analysing it and saying, well, look, this is an example of how irrational capitalism is. It will destroy billions of pounds and dollars and francs in investments over an irrational panic on the markets. And so that's always been there. But I think that the fact that we live in a hyper-financialized world, and with the globalization of capital, and with particularly regard to American and British capitalism to a degree as well, with it being this hyper-financialized system which needs to move its money in a very, very rapid fashion to service its multiple debt bubbles, that system that is there breeds a far greater degree of irrationality than would previously existed. Capitalism is becoming more irrational over time, not less. And of course, because you have that degenerated economic base, that filters through into the superstructure, the political, social, cultural, and artistic superstructure also degenerates along with it. So Donald Trump, who is, in political terms, nothing more extraordinary than a 1980s or 90s Democrat, running a government that looks like a sort of more chaotic version of something that Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio would run, that suddenly is viewed as a fascist takeover to the point where you now have CIA guys going on TV, or so-called ex-CIA guys. There's no real such thing as an ex-CIA guy, calling for the deployment of the full arsenal of war on terror material to be used on a section of the American population. That's insane. That's crazy. A capitalist system which is healthy and is confident and is profitable does not do that. And the fact that they're even talking this way when we're not even in a period of significant working class struggle tells you how strange it's gotten and how degenerated it's gotten. In many ways, the bourgeoisie's job would be almost easier if they had a mass workers' movement to struggle against and repress.
They'd be a lot smarter, that's for sure.
Well, they'd probably have to be. They'd have to be smarter.
Exactly.
But because they've degenerated so far, they're in now this strange paranoid hall of mirrors where everything is done on, like you said about the pandemic. It's a lot of, because they've internalized a political culture based on marketing so much that the politicians it produces now are so stupid. Like we found out today that the health minister here, Matt Hancock, is a complete moron. But he was basing his policies, some of his policies, on a Steven Soderbergh film about a pandemic from 2011. He was watching a movie for it to get his political advice from. And the fact that not only does he do that, he then brags about it in an interview. So that I give that. I mean, that's not about Trump, but it shows you how bad these people have gotten, that they think that that's a clever move that they brag about. So yeah, this is where we are. This is to understand Trump, to understand the pandemic, to understand a lot of what goes on domestically now in the advanced capitalist nations. You have to understand it as an expression of extreme bourgeois degeneracy.
Yeah. So you had another question in this agenda, which I thought was really good. I don't have some very clear thoughts on it, but so if the United States have to go through this, okay, you know what? That's what you get for being the throne of capital. Yeah. You have to go through it. But why do we have to go through it, Alex? Why do we in the Commonwealth have to also import stupid U.S. politics into situations that are even less relevant than the United States?
Well, you can.
Why?
Well, you can thank us for that for a start, because we left you with a political system that was containing a lot of the worst elements of the British one, but was inevitably going to be influenced by the hyperpower just over the border. So
it's true. It's a combination of it's a federalism meets parliamentary monarchy.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
So, yeah. I mean, we would joke about it, but the extreme capitalist degeneracy of like the United States and Britain because those are the two principal influences over Canada and other countries as well, Australia and New Zealand, the other Commonwealth nations, the other old capitalist nations in Europe are going down similar, if slightly different lines. Unfortunately, you're getting it both barrels, from the degenerate American ruling class and the degenerate British ruling class, to the point where the Canadian ruling class produces a Justin Trudeau. And
Jagmeet Singh too.
Yes, yeah. And the question I put down in the notes when we were preparing for the episode was that why is it that the other ruling classes are so determined to import this? And it's all a product of degeneracy. Some of them see the more clever and cynical do see a value in bringing importing something like, the branding of Black Lives Matter into a Canadian or a British context, because it is very good branding to stick on government documents. So, for instance, now you're seeing in British terms, they're starting to adopt BLM points, sort of stylings and language into equalities policies in British government departments, because it's, again, they think that's a legitimation process that they can go through to sort of give some more juice to the system, bring in something which looks like radical outsiderdom into the system, and give it some more energy. And it's good for the branding, makes you look good, it makes certain middle class people feel good, maybe you get a few votes out of it. But overall, it's that this is somewhere where the US ruling class goes, and unfortunately we and you follow. So
yeah.
And unfortunately for both of us, the left in both our countries goes down the rabbit hole with them, because again, the left these days, divorced from working class struggle, is just an expression of the left wing, the more ultra liberal wing of the bourgeoisie. That's all the left is in Canada, and it's all the left is in Britain. Or am I being unfair?
No, of course not. You're being too fair. I actually think that they're the worst part of the bourgeoisie. They're the most reactionary part of the bourgeoisie, more so than the right. They're completely nihilistic. They want to destroy, they want to destroy whatever is left of, kind of feudal institutions, I suppose, and just give it all up to the market. I mean, that's how I view them anyways.
Well, that's because that's exactly what they are, because they've, since the 60s, they've absorbed what's popularly referred to as the neoliberal impulse as their entire politics. Because,
exactly. Yeah.
Because a lot of it, the class origins of a lot of the left are fundamentally bourgeois and petty bourgeois, and the more sort of petty bourgeois radical end is just pushing towards the destruction of all boundaries and structures in capitalist society, powered on by the fact that they're fundamentally based on finance capital, which seeks to annihilate all boundaries. So therefore the left, being the servants of it, also seek to eliminate all boundaries, even though I don't even think they really know why they're doing it.
And the worst part about it is they do it all in the name of the working class, and they do so clothed in the rhetoric of Marxist theory and socialism, and it makes for very ironic theater. No, I definitely think that's correct. They're definitely a wing of the bourgeoisie. And it's the most aggressive kind of.
It's actually very useful to the bourgeoisie in a way, because the left dressing itself as communists, Maoists, whatever-ist, and adopting various forms of sort of bastardized Marxism. Ultimately, if I was a bourgeois strategist, I'd be very happy with that, because it disgraces what could be a potentially dangerous set of ideas if, again, we got to the point where a lot of workers were reading and learning from them, with them being attached to a sideshow of carnivalesque freaks. Who is going to want to be associated with that?
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, so no, I think that's completely fair. I think it's a fair interpretation of the left, but I think it's unfair that innocent Canadians and innocent British people have to be subjected to ridiculous American politics.
Yeah.
We have even less.
Americans, I know some of you listen to this. The stats tell me that half the listeners are in America, so I'm running. This is a very risky thing we're doing now. But for God's sake, can you keep your freaks inside the borders of the continental United States? We have enough of them in Britain.
Yeah, we produce enough for ourselves. We don't need your exports.
Yeah,
you're not sending your best.
You're sending your worst, and that says quite a lot. Keep your Democratic Party aligned lunatics busy in Brooklyn. If it's too expensive there, maybe send them somewhere cheaper. But for God's sake, don't send them to Manchester. We had enough problems with that guy you sent over here to run Occupy Manchester, but more of him in another episode.
American art, it's fine. I really like The Expanse, so more of that, more TV shows like that, less politics. Just keep that indoors.
No, come on, Layla.
Anyways.
You know that it comes as in a full package. You take the TV shows, you have to take the BLM branding, and you have to take Justin Trudeau saying it's people kind.
You know what? I think The Expanse is very good, so I am actually willing to make that. I'm willing to make the sacrifice.
Okay.
I'm not convinced that Justin Trudeau would be any better without American influence. So.
Probably worse. Whereas, of course, our Prime Minister, or the greatest living bourgeois politician, as we proclaimed him to be in the last episode we did, is of course born in the United States. So he's
what? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's born in the US.
He's so good.
Oh yeah, that's why he's so brilliant.
He's like a product of like modern capital.
Yeah, he is modern capital in one crazy person. And
he's also Turkish, right? Like his origins are.
He's great.
Amazing.
One of his great grandfathers was from Istanbul in the Ottoman period. So
the great empires of the world coming together in one person.
You've got Ottoman, the Ottoman Sultanate, the American Empire, the decaying British Empire, all in one man. That's why he's so good.
We only rate our politicians from 0 to Boris. Boris being king.
Boris being the king.
All right.
Well, I think on that bombshell of critical support for Boris Johnson, we have and of course a call for the Americans. For those of you listening out there, for God's sake, lock your freaks up. I think we can put a pin in the episode there, can't we?
Yeah, I think we covered it. It's a good show.
So thank you everybody for listening. We will be back with more for you next week. But until then, everybody, always be aware that everything you are seeing, even the things that seem the most baffling and confusing and the things that most make you want to put on the tinfoil hat and join Alex Jones in his bunker in Austin, all of these things can be analysed. All of these things can be... They are explainable and they are understandable. And one of the things we aim to do with this show is to demonstrate how this degeneration in the bourgeoisie creates a lot of this. And this comes back down to the understanding of what the economic base is and how that ripple effect goes up through the superstructure into the wider society. So if we've done that in this examination of Trump and fascism, I hope that we have, and I hope that you've gained something out of it. Because if you just read bourgeois media, you'll end up with not being even to explain what your name is anymore.
Yeah, and I think it would be good to do a show. I think that there is a lot of truth to the idea that there is more kind of authoritarianism that exists, but I think we need to remember that like capitalism is authoritarian as a baseline. It just
always has been.
Exactly, it always has been, and the bourgeoisie is lying to you when it says that, oh, this is like an attack on American democracy. It's not. This is American democracy. This is bourgeois democracy, basically. So it's not any different. This is what it looks like when there's no working class opposition.
Exactly.
This is the purest form. So I think people shouldn't be misled like that and made scared that we're in some kind of apocalyptic, neo-fascist era, because it's more of the same.
Yeah.
It's bad, but it's just more of the same.
But with new branding.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. See you next time.